Okay, we have reached 1 o'clock Eastern time, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Kari Gregory. I'm the co-facilitator of these Friday learning series calls. Today's discussion topic is going to be Module 2, the logic behind OCD. This is from the Clinician's Handbook for Obsessive-Compulsive Disorders, Inference-based Therapy, written by Kieran O'Connor and Frederick Ardema. Today, we will be led by Bronwyn Shroyer. Bronwyn is a licensed clinical social worker and runs a private practice specializing in OCD, PTSD, and infidelity trauma. She especially loves working with comorbid PTSD, OCD cases and is a lived experience clinician for both disorders. Bronwyn provides training and consultation for I-CBT and is certified EMDR therapist and consultant in training. She's also certified ERP therapist through the Center for the Treatment and Study of Anxiety. Bronwyn sees adults, teens, children in her practice and is a founding member of the OCD Lived Experience Collective. So with no further ado, Bronwyn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Excited to be here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen.
Go lay down. Go lay down. Get up here.
Oh, Paul, you need to mute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I was talking to my dog, Lucy.
I was like, I know that voice. That's Paul. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And then we'll get started. Okay. All right. I am really excited to do this particular module. I tend to say that like all the modules are my favorites, but this one's especially like pertinent to like my I-CBT journey. So I'm very excited to be doing this one. And when I started seeing people talk about I-CBT, like many of you, probably I'd never heard of it. And I thought, a different treatment exists. So I started paying attention. I tracked every single word Fred Ardema, Carl Robbins, and Mike Hetty ever said. And I decided to check out Fred's website and ordered the manual and started reading over the modules. And then when I got to this module, I remember this because I was sitting on my couch and I almost started shaking with excitement because I felt so completely understood on a gut level for the first time in my life as a lived experience person. And so this module was what pulled me into I-CBT. So I'm super excited to be talking about it with you guys today. So why did I feel so understood? For those that don't know me, OCD has been a part of my life for almost 30 years now, and started after I was told as a teen that my mother was facing a possible terminal illness and that she probably had 3 months left to live. And thankfully, even though that was an extremely agonizing time, we got an answer that she was actually going to be okay. But by then, my OCD had taken root and it has been my companion in life ever since. And the experience with my mom played into the background of a lot of my obsessions. There was a lot of stuff around my mom's favorite number, all these things started to come up that was about my mom. And to me, I could see connections with things I'd experienced, things I knew about. There were reasons I really felt that I needed to listen to my obsessional doubts. That pull was so strong. And I had always felt that there was something missing for me and my understanding of my OCD and why certain thoughts hooked me and others didn't, especially because it felt so real, right? And I had reasons for why I was fearful of the things OCD locked onto. So this module, coupled with module 4, which is called the vulnerable self theme, gave me an answer I've been searching for almost 30 years. So here are the teaching points that we are going to focus on in module 2 with your clients. There is reasoning behind the obsessional doubt. This reasoning seems logical and credible to the client. The problem isn't the content of the reasoning process. Instead, it's the context of it that makes the logic irrelevant. So these are the things we're going to try to teach our clients when we're doing module 2. So what is reasoning anyway? Why do we care about it? Why is it important? So this is directly from Fred and Kieran's book. It's how we make sense of the world, how we arrive at inferences or conclusions about the world. It allows us to be sure of concluding that this is this and that is that. So reasons are not always logical. They can be full of emotion. Sometimes they can be an urge, like I feel like I should. But there are stories. Reasoning is, these stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, and they make sense to us and they feel reasonable to the client that's going to be in front of you. Not always reasonable. Sometimes clients have insight that this thing doesn't make sense, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too, but often they feel reasonable. So in the worksheets for this module, clients are asked to come up with the reasoning behind their obsessional doubts. And there are all these things they're going to be able to pull from, right? So some of these listed here are ones from me, but there are 5 main reasoning categories that we can put these into. So we've got facts, and such as germs exist, people get hurt, robberies happen, right? And then we have rules. So police say to lock the doors at night, or we're supposed to wash our hands before we eat. And then personal experiences. I was in a car accident, or, I've gotten food poisoning. Those are all personal experiences that people can pull from and that inform their logic. There can be hearsay, so stories from other people, things we've read about, seen in movies, anything like that, seen on the news. The news is a big one. So stories of being killed or accidents happening, those kinds of stuff. And then OCD's absolute favorite thing in the world, which is just that things are possible. So as Kari stated before in my bio at the beginning of this presentation, I'm a clinician with lived experience of PTSD. I also have I have a few traumas in my past. And one of the things I put on this slide here is this car accident one, right? And so I was in this horrible car accident where a van crossed a median on an interstate and slammed into my car. And I was knocked unconscious, and I had hard contact lenses in. And when the airbag came up, they broke in my eyes, and they caused a lot of wounds to my eyes. And that all healed. I have slight permanent damage, but nothing big. But so you can tell that that made me a little afraid of being in a car. And that took a few weeks for me to heal and be allowed to drive like medical release drive. When I got in the car for the very first time, you guys, I'm not kidding. When I got in the car for the very first time and I'm driving to work, guess what happens? A car going the opposite way does the exact same thing, slips on ice, comes and across my traffic path and slams into a building. So these are the things that we're talking about as reasons for why your clients are buying into them so strongly. Like, there was no way at that point in time, if somebody told me content didn't matter, I'd have been like, what are you talking about? Like, this matters to me. These are my stories. So experiences that we collect stay with us, and they help inform our stories about ourselves and our world, and they matter to us as people. So all of those things are the reasoning behind some obsessional stories, because they're very, very, very real. All right. But my reasons are special, clients might say. So in module 2, we're going to ask our clients to also come up with possible reasons behind other people's obsessional doubts. So this is going to be an off-theme practice. You're not going to have them practice on something that links into them. You're going to have them find a situation where they can look at somebody else's obsessional doubt and see the reasoning behind it. This allows them to see that the reasoning behind doubts they don't have is just as plausible as their own. And there is some logic that the person with the doubt can come up with to justify the doubt, right? So they're going to be able to come up with something, even though they don't believe it, that could justify that doubt. So by doing this exercise, you help the client start to notice that their reasons aren't any more special than somebody else's reasons. They're just reasons. So therefore, their reasoning isn't necessarily special. But content doesn't matter, right? Like, well, I mean, we're taught this a lot, that content doesn't matter, that it's irrelevant, and that's true, but it's also not true. And so I'm going to show you why this doesn't work for me as a lived experience clinician. So let's look at my reasoning for some of my doubts in a different way. All right. So we're going to just have a blanket thing of my reasoning. I'm going to take you through what are just a handful of the reasons that were informing my doubt over time. So the first one was germs exist. Here's a fact, right? Fact from that reasoning category slide. Fact, germs exist. Can't argue that with people. They're there. Then we've got people die. That's fact too. Then we got robberies happen. Also happens. Hearsay stories, robberies do happen. I was hospitalized with illness. I was hospitalized several times with illness. So I know that illnesses can harm me and that they can make me really sick, right? God is watching. I grew up in a school that was a parochial school. So every day at school, I was hearing stories about, my faith and what was important, and that God was seeing everything I was doing. And so I interpreted that as, God's watching everything I do. I was in several car accidents, as I already spoke about. There have been others, never any of them my fault, you guys. Not a single one has ever been my fault. Locks can fail. They do fail sometimes. That's just a fact. I witnessed someone die in an accident, so I had to deal with that situation. I have gotten others sick. So I know I've brought home stomach bugs from school, and my whole family has gotten sick. I've brought home the flu from school. Everybody got sick. We are supposed to be responsible. That's kind of a societal rule, right? We're supposed to be responsible about things. People have accidentally hit someone with their cars. I've seen a lot of stories where somebody's accidentally hit and run happens. That informed my doubt. Ovens have caused house fires. I've known people who have had house fires. Young people can have heart attacks. I went through a period of time where I was very focused on my heart rate and I was getting heart palpitations. So all of those stories helped inform doubts around my health. Random acts of violence. This one's big even in the news today, right? Like these things happen. So you can see that I start to get lost as a human being underneath all of those reasons, right? Like they are so big and so alive in your clients that these things, if you argue with them about them, that's not going to get you anywhere. And we're going to talk about that in a minute too, because they've really bought into these reasons. And we are our stories. The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves really do matter. And the stories we tell ourselves about our world matter. And underneath all that content is a human being. So why do we need to deal with the content? Why does establishing this matter at all? So by establishing logic behind the OCD, clients and therapists both win. Taking time to go over this gets the duo on the same team. Clients feel seen, they feel understood, they feel that someone is listening to all this logic swirling around in their minds. People with OCD use logic in other areas of their lives, and that can be taken seriously by others. But when they use logic in OCD, it's often dismisses them being crazy or irrational or nuts. And while they are applying their logic incorrectly, and they are doing that, and that's what I-CBT is about here, the logic itself is not those things. It's not crazy or irrational or nuts. Standing alone on its own, that logic is solid. It's correct. Germs do exist. They are on all surfaces. If you go to the CDC website right now, you will see them say that germs exist on all surfaces, and that's why they advise wiping them down. So we can't tell people that their content doesn't matter, because it can make them feel dismissed. So trying to argue that with somebody with contamination OCD isn't going to get us anywhere about the germs. But denying them that their facts are correct is also not amenable towards validating them as humans who are intelligent beings, right? So we just get out of arguments if we just, yep, your logic is solid. Like that helps you get out of the arguments of the content. And the reason this is important is because if the content isn't the problem, right? If we're already with our clients and we've already said, yes, your logic makes sense in certain contexts, right? That logic is sound as a standalone thing, then the problem isn't with the content. It lies elsewhere in OCD. So we don't have to argue with it. It's not factually wrong. But what's driving that problem lies elsewhere, outside of the logic. It has to be something else. And that means we can help them open up then to learning about how they are applying their logic. And that's what matters here. In later modules, we'll talk more about relevancy and how important it is to this work. But for now, you should know that what's coming is to teach our clients that they are taking that logic that isn't faulty and applying it in a faulty way without direct evidence in the here and now to back it up. And that is what is causing them to struggle. So with these four things, this is why we need to do this work, to sit and talk to them about their logic. Because if you don't take that time, then they're going to feel like you aren't on their side. And that was really important for me. That was a really big piece of the puzzle for me, was to sit and really have, it was Fred, Carl, and Mike understanding, like telling me like, hey, look at I-CBT. Like this whole thing just made so much sense to me right from the get-go. So let's go back to my OCD for a moment. I went through a few therapists. Some had no idea what to do with me. One definitely knew what she was doing with me. She was a very well-trained ERP therapist and did a really great job. And she did help me get back to functioning with my life. But I was still left with doubts. So why did they keep coming? The intrusive thought explanation seemed like I would forever be doomed to be having like these bombardment of terrible images or terrible thoughts. And maybe I could keep the compulsions at bay or at least diminished, right? But a life with doubts coming and staying stuck wasn't the quality of life I wanted for myself. And so I didn't habituate well. I was a model patient. I did my homework. My therapist called me multiple times a week. I tracked everything. I didn't habituate well. And even though I learned I could get through stuff and some situations became more tolerable, the anxiety didn't go away completely and the obsessions kept coming. So part of this was a PTSD response going on at the same time. And even though after a very transformative treatment for that, I still struggled with obsessions, but doing the PTSD treatment did allow me to loosen that up enough that I was able to tap into my ERP skills a little bit more. But what was missing for me was someone talking to me about my logic. As standalone facts, they absolutely made sense. They were correct in my reasoning. I just wasn't applying it correctly. And no one had listened to my reasoning or told me how to apply it correctly. And that was what changed my OCD trajectory. So what happened when no one listened to me was I felt stupid. Was I the only person in the world that paid attention to this stuff? Was I the only person in the world that listened to the CDC telling me that germs were on everything? It's a very lonely experience when you are out there and everybody else in the world is somehow able to ignore that logic and just kind of keep going with their lives. But for you, I was taught to be responsible. I was taught to embrace science. I was taught to listen to what my teachers taught me, right? And I was trying to do a good job there with all that logic that was there, that germs exist. So I should be worried about that, right? I didn't understand at the time that I was applying it out of context. So my thoughts were, why isn't everybody walking around with their hands in their sleeves as they open doors? And why isn't everybody making sure to check their doors at night? It didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. The other thing that happened was I felt angry. I felt like nobody was listening to me and I was dismissed. Like what I thought didn't matter, not in a content way, but yes, in a content way, but also in a human way. I knew all these things about myself. Like I knew in my heart of heart that I was just trying to do the right thing. I was trying so hard to listen to everybody around me and do the right thing. But when that was dismissed from me, it felt like I was being dismissed. And I felt a lot of anger around that. And then the other thing that was happening was that I didn't know who to trust. My logic was telling me one thing. I could trust it most of the time in situations, and that was good. Like I felt like I could go around and use my logic in non-OCD situations. But so why couldn't I then use it in OCD situations? I needed to be taught that whole piece about my logic and how I was applying it wrong. And when I learned how I was applying it out of context, it was like pieces of myself snapped together. I know that some of my other fellow lived experience clinicians and I have talked about this a lot, this like magical moment of this all falling into place for you is something that it truly is indescribable in a way, but it was transformative. It was like just this, all of a sudden, this piece of me that had been kind of fragmented and not understood was just made whole right away in this way that just made so much sense to me. And so this is a life-changing thing that you can bring to your clients by allowing them to understand that you don't feel like they're stupid, that yes, they've been through things, that yes, they are listening to science, that all those things are there. They're just applying that information incorrectly. And that is going to be work for other modules, but it's important for you to understand that here too. So some clients do feel their thoughts come out of nowhere, and not all clients are going to be like me and be super attuned into their reasoning process. Some clients will feel like these doubts just pop in, and but there will be reasoning behind them. The reasoning will be there. It just may not be as noticeable to those particular clients. So how do we help them get to that reasoning? How do we help them understand that there are reasons behind their doubts, especially if they've been taught that OCD is based on intrusive thoughts that are then appraised, right? How do we help those clients then understand this through an I-CBT lens? So what we're going to do here is we're going to have your clients argue for OCD's side. So if you ask them to take on the voice of their OCD and try to convince you why their obsessional doubt is reasonable, you'll find the logic. I mean, you can't argue without reasons, right? There has to be a reason that's coming up. This even goes for magical thinking. So something like, what if I don't tap my contact lens case just right and my mom dies, right? Like there's reasoning behind that. It doesn't look like it maybe early on, but it is there. Even I, at the time, knew when I was doing that particular type of obsessive compulsive behavior that it wasn't rational, but possibility is still a part of OCD, right? It's a huge part of OCD. So the reasoning there for me is that anything is possible. Maybe God would punish me, right? Remember, I was in this very faith-based environment. And so I had been taught like all these things that I needed to ask for forgiveness, that like all these things are happening, that God was all powerful. And I was applying that to these situations where maybe God would punish me for doing something wrong. Or maybe there were magical forces that I didn't know about in the world, or karma, something. But there is a reason, even if it feels far-fetched. So you sit there, you have your client argue OCD side to you, and then the logic is going to flow. But there are issues that can come up with some clients that are a little bit more difficult to deal with. And this first one is called automatization. And sometimes OCD is just really well rehearsed, right? So it almost seems like there isn't even a doubt anymore. It's like trigger compulsion. People, touch something, they wash their hands. They aren't even thinking. It's just like this ritualized thing that keeps going. So like for me, for a long time, when I would leave the house, I would just jiggle the doorknob like 4 times, probably. I think it was 4. It's been a long time. But I would do it really fast. And I did it without thinking. There wasn't anything like necessarily right in front of me with it. So the reasons weren't right there in front of me. I was just doing it. But if I were to step back a little bit, I could probably backtrack that to when all that stuff happened, right? And I could probably find the reasons, which is, I don't want my house to get robbed when I leave, or, my cat's inside. I don't want the cat to accidentally get out. I would have been able to look back and probably find where that ritual began. So if your client says, I really just don't know, I just do it, that's what we're talking about in this process here. And then we've got aversion to the doubts. So this is when people perceive their thoughts as uncontrolled. This can be more upsetting than the thought itself, like that process that they just don't have control over their thoughts, and they'll consider themselves as victims of their mind and unable to realize that reasoning is there. So an example of this could be something along the lines of a taboo thought, like, what if I want to have sex with my parent? That thought comes, from someplace, and then there's so much like aversion to it, right? Like even though the client has zero intent around it, it truly doesn't make sense to them that they would have that thought. And so the controllability of the thought coming is very upsetting. I don't understand where it comes from. I just can't get it out of my mind. None of it makes sense to me. Another thing that can happen here is an imaginative process. And as you go through I-CBT, you're going to learn more and more about different imaginative processes, but we'll discuss those in later modules for you. But it's a good idea to keep these clients, like help them back up and find what's going on right when they went into the imaginative state. This way they can find the doubt and the reasoning behind it. So an example for me that comes to mind is images. Often I would get like something would happen, this image would pop into my mind, and I would get so absorbed in it that I didn't even notice really a thought of doubt. And I think images can be their own form of doubt, but I'm just in it all of a sudden. Like it's right there in front of me. It's very, very vivid. I'm seeing everything play out. Most of the time for me, these images had to do with danger to my family. So they were really emotionally absorbing as well. And I would just get pulled into them. So I'm totally in a dissociative state, right? Like this is what we talk about when we're talking about the bubble, which you'll learn about in module 7. That you're pulled into this huge story all of a sudden, and you're there. And so it happens so quickly that you may not realize that there were reasonings behind that. And you're so stuck in the story that you're not thinking about that. So I'm just stuck in it, right? So you skip right over the reasons, but they're there. The reasons are still there. You just have to help them get back out. And then we've got decontextualization. So clients realize that the obsession doesn't make sense in this context, which is ultimately what we want to have happen, right? Like that's a good thing. But in this case, they're feeling like there isn't reason behind it. Like they realize already it doesn't make sense to be doing, which is good for the context part, but there is going to still be reasoning behind it. So it's great that they don't see the link to the here and now, but then dismissing it as not having a reason won't be accurate. So often possibility or even far-fetched, like a really far-fetched ideas come into play here. So example from me is I could have a doubt that I could cause my family's death by not reading like a paragraph of a novel absolutely correctly. And I knew that that didn't make any sense. Like there's nothing linked between me relaxing and reading a book and then my family like having some huge, terrible, catastrophic thing happen, right? And I knew that didn't make sense. But in the world, so like there could still be possibility. And so karma, those things can come back up again in this with this decontextualization. So something might come get me or my loved ones, some magical force. Otherwise, like if there wasn't some kind of reason, I wouldn't buy into it. Okay, so this is not a very hugely long module. So we're going to be stopping here in just a second. But how we know our clients are ready to move forward. We're going to know this when the person understands that there is reasoning behind the doubt in the OCD. So it's very important that you don't move forward in your treatment goals or treatment modules until they understand that there is reasoning behind the doubt and that the reasoning justifies the doubt somehow. So that's a link we want to make. And then the doubt does not come from nowhere, but it's a reasoned conclusion. So they're using reasoning to back up the doubt. And then the client accepts and understands the reason as the basis for the doubt. Okay, so those are the things that we're trying to teach in module 2. And that is the end. So if anybody has questions, and I'm ready if my voice holds up.
I have a question. So you mentioned decontextualization, and I'm just wondering if you can think of some other examples of that. And I had a client that I was going over module 2 with just this morning, and in the client exercise sheet, there's an extra line that says like personal reasons. So there's like all the different logic categories, and then there's just kind of a blank one. And for her, what she noticed was that she has like a sort of like an individualized rule. I have to do the plan. Hers has a lot to do with time management and fear of not doing things precisely. And her common reason is I have to do the plan that is in my head. I'm just wondering if that is something that you've seen.
Can she give you a reason for why she has to do the plan that's in her head?
Well, what we ended up doing was saying, okay, is there a doubt behind that? And then the doubt was that was kind of an aha for her. And then she said, what we kind of came around to was this may be getting closer to like a core doubt of what if I make mistakes in general. Like she's very perfectionistic. But
yeah, I'm also wondering if she's got maybe some blending going on. And so blending is where you take something that is like, heralded as a great trait, like responsibility, and you blend it in with something with your OCD, right? So like I have to have everything put together because that is a good thing I'm doing. So I have to do this thing because it's good, or because it is responsible. Or it is, I'm being ecological by picking up every single tiny possible thing I can ever find as I go along the street because I need to be ecological and recycle it. Like those kinds of things where you get excessive about it. Does that help?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. Because when we looked at it as sort of a core doubt or, rule, it does apply to almost all of her obsessions. So yeah.
Yeah. Fred, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, that also could simply be the doubt, right? I mean, you call it a core doubt, which is good, because in OCD, you sometimes can never go back far enough. And I would not hesitate to ask, for example, well, why do you think that? What is the reason behind it? As Bronwyn just said, like, what is the reason for the thing that she does? I forgot what it was, but it can just be like the doubt can be, what if I made the modules? Then the question becomes, what is the relevance of that doubt in the context in which it occurs? And if it's an obsessional doubt, then there's something wrong with the context in which that doubt of making a mistake arises. What you described almost sound, but the consequences of that, which you described, was almost more like a compulsion. What was it exactly again? I forgot what it was. What was her initial that you thought was the initial doubt?
Oh, she gave several, but one is, what if I don't follow my study plan for homework, and I get behind schoolwork?
Right.
And when she was listing all the logic,
Yeah.
some people get behind, and this has happened to me before. And then there was like this blank line on the worksheet, and she just said, I have to follow the plan in my head.
Yeah,
And she did that.
that sounds more like the compulsion. So you try to, she has this doubt, what if I made a mistake? So therefore I have to make a plan or go through the plan in my head. It's the neutralization or the compulsion that seems to come afterwards. So when a person does something, usually the question of why do you do that? Well, I get anxious if I don't do it. What is it that makes you anxious? That's probably where the doubt is. So you track backwards. The person, it's not like you're inventing it. You're just giving the person the question. The person volunteers it themselves. It's important. We don't invent reasons for people with OCD. It's observable. It's communicated. There are situations that may not be immediately accessible because of some of the reasons that Bronwyn mentioned. But if you ask them the question, then the answers arise naturally. We're not trying to infer reasons, ourselves as therapists. They are volunteered by the person with OCD, sometimes easily and sometimes a little bit less easily.
Yeah, I hope it didn't sound like I gave her that reason. But when I asked her, what are you afraid of?
Oh, I know you didn't. I know you didn't.
Okay.
I'm just saying it in general.
Okay.
I have a question. I'm struggling with like how to present to clients the idea that these thoughts and doubts don't come out of nowhere when it's kind of a more taboo theme. If they're thinking, I wonder if I'm going to kill my partner or if I'm a child molester. How do you present that so they can kind of accept that when, there may be these questions, a person without OCD wouldn't have these thoughts. Why am I getting these thoughts? What is the reasoning behind them kind of popping up? So that may be something that comes up in a later module, but I'm just wondering, because, every time that, there is the discussion that there is the thoughts, the doubts, the obsessions aren't just popping up out of nowhere. There's a reasoning. I'm kind of going back to those more taboo themes and how we would conceptualize that with our clients.
Yeah. So two things. One is once you get to module 4, which is the vulnerable self theme, that's going to become even easier for you to talk about with your client, because the vulnerable self is the exact opposite of who they really are. And it's OCD's ultimate lie, right? Your OCD's ultimate lie is to tell you, if you don't do these things, you might become this person, right? And so my guess is those clients are incredibly don't want to cause harm to anyone, right? And so once you figure out what their vulnerable self theme is, it will help them understand why certain thoughts get taken in. So for instance, my vulnerable self thing is I do not want to be a person that is negligent. That is my biggest fear. That's what OCD would latch onto right away, is that I'm going to somehow cause myself to get sick. I'm going to get my kids sick. I'm going to cause an accident. I'm going to something, right? All those negligent things. And so I never had any themes about sexual orientation OCD, for instance. It doesn't fit into my negligence theme. I never had anything to do with pedophilia OCD. Somehow my OCD didn't link that with negligence. So it just never happened for me. So I'm kind of safeguarded against that because I don't link those things to negligence. And so that's one way. The second thing, which now I'm going to forget, but maybe it'll come back to me. When you're trying to help them understand why those doubts, the reasoning piece will still be there. They will have heard stories about people molesting children. They will have heard stories about whatever it is their fear has happened, or it's just that it's possible. Like all those reasons can still add up. There is going to be logic back there, I promise. Does that help?
Yeah,
Yeah, I would just wonder, I'm sorry if I'm interrupting you, Fred, you're a little frozen. I hope I'm not talking over you.
It's okay. We have, or at least I have sound problems. Yeah, no, exactly as Bronwyn said. It clarifies itself further, especially within that theme, with the vulnerable self theme. But I mean, there are reasons behind when you ask a person who thinks that they might be a pedophile, that they may be a sexual deviant, that they may be a murderer, a psychopath, whatever. There are reasons that people give. I mean, the best one, the one that almost always comes up in one way or another. I unconsciously might be one. You know, that's like the favorite one. It's like, because it's hidden. Anything that's invisible and hidden in OCD is fodder for it, for the reasons. You know, that's why the imagination is so important. So anything that's invisible, including things invisible in your own mind, that's usually where OCD moves into in terms of the reasons behind it. You know? As absurd as it may seem, once you start asking, the OCD starts to make sense. You know, for example, I had once a client that had the doubt, if I concentrate, I might be invaded by demons. I think, well, where the hell does that come from? You know, but when you ask him, he said, like, well, concentrating is like meditation. I've heard stories about people who meditate, who got bad experience, images of demons while they were meditating. So therefore, if I concentrate, I might be invaded by demons. You know, it seems very remote, and often people with OCD recognize it. But once you go into the reason, it becomes a little bit more logical. There's a story behind it that sort of at least builds up to that doubt. And you can no longer say at that point that the doubt comes out of nowhere.
That makes sense. Thank you both so much.
You're welcome. Jeremy, I see you raising your hand.
Yeah, so if I can try to like directly answer what you're asking, Samantha, it's like if you're saying that there's a reasoning behind this, then that is making the patient feel nervous that you're about to say something that's going to justify them having these thoughts and feelings. If we are setting up a rationale for I-CBT before the start of it, and we're explaining a process of inferential confusion in some general terms, then maybe it's not so threatening to say, we already know that the reasons that you're going to come up with here are going to be full of inferential confusion. And we don't fully know why. We're not trying to explain that in this model. We're just trying to put all them down. But putting them down, it might be a little bit threatening to investigate this. I can see why that would be true, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to be giving credit to these reasons all the way through the program. I think that setting that up in the rationale might help with that discomfort and explaining that there is a reason.
And I think something that was really helpful last week was when Amanda clarified that the obsessions and doubts don't come out of nowhere, but you can still in this I-CBT, the intrusive thoughts can kind of come out of nowhere, if I understood that correctly. No.
Someone else answered that.
What do you think about that, Fred?
I may have understood it correctly.
Can you repeat that question? I've been sleeping at the wheel here.
So I guess I understood it as like the obsessions and the doubts don't like come out of nowhere. There's a reasoning behind them, but you can still have these kind of intrusive thoughts that can pop up from without the reasoning behind them.
If I'm understanding.
Yeah, I
correctly-
mean,
Go ahead.
oh,
So I was
yeah,
going to say that intrusive thoughts still do exist. I think everyone kind of accepts the idea there are
Sure.
random intrusive
yeah,
thoughts.
exactly.
We're just saying that's not the cause of the obsession. Like the random intrusive thought could be the trigger, or it could be included in the reasoning process. But yeah, we're saying that intrusive thoughts are not the cause of it.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the clarification, Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, totally fine. Anybody else have a question? Go ahead, Julia.
I had this conversation a few weeks ago, and I was going to post in the group, but I don't know. I don't like. I didn't feel comfortable doing that. But now I'm being recorded, right? So never mind. This client that I'm working with, the same one that I met with this morning, we had a whole session kind of talking about.
Just in case, if it's about a client,
Okay.
if it's generalized or remote from the case itself, just the last time the organizers had to take a lot of time with editing and all that, it takes a long time. So maybe
Okay, well,
I don't know how detailed it is, but
now, okay, let me say it in a general. I was going to try to do that, but I'll be extra careful. My question has to do with thinking about reasons for a doubt and how they're tied to personal experience, especially in the context of childhood experiences. And Bronwyn, you said you specialize in combining, trauma and OCD. And so, without going into detail of that person's experience, I'm thinking a lot about the, attachment relationships and how, I talk a lot with my clients about attachment, their early experiences, and attunement, for example, and how important that parent-child relationship is in providing, via the attunement process, reflecting back to the child themselves. And I've seen this come up over and over again where clients have some kind of disrupted attachment experience with their parents in which they were dismissed over and over again. And I'm just wondering if you've seen that as a common experience in OCD. And do you bring that up as here's your personal experience in the here and now, but then there's also like historically these experiences of being dismissed and therefore doubting yourself, right? Sort of, planting the seed of you don't trust yourself.
Yeah, sure. I mean, those are all like that personal experience stuff can go all the way back, right? Like it can go back into childhood. It can definitely do that. I mean, somebody in the chat was asking like the stuff that I had in there about like God is watching, that kind of stuff. That is a rule that I was taught, right? So like all those things all those personal experiences and things with parents too, like if you were taught that, you shouldn't do something, then that can add into your logic for sure.
I'll jump in here, just a couple of points. Number one,
it can add into the logic, and at the same time, it can also be maybe play a role in how inferential confusion started, right? It can even like certain experiences can lead to a lack of trust in self and senses. I mean, it makes sense theoretically, scientifically, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. They don't, but they still don't. What Bronwyn is saying, they still don't provide any justification in the present, right? But yes, the inferential confusion, that's an important research question, which there is some research on that OCD is linked to attachment and all that, and I suspect inferential confusion as well. Unfortunately, there's very little research in general on early causes of OCD or trauma, the effect it may have on development of OCD or early childhood experiences. We know fairly little, but I mean, theoretically, yeah, for sure, that all makes sense. If a person can pinpoint, this is where I lost confidence in myself, I think that's important to address.
Yeah, you saw it play out with mine. I mean, my OCD is very linked to that event with my mom. and then my world
Julia-
was going to crumble.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, Julia, if you're interested in this, Guy Duran actually has published some papers on the connection between DORON. Actually, he's the ROCD. He's probably the leading researcher on ROCD. ROCD.net is his website, but he's also done some research on the connection between early attachment and OCD. And I think that one of the places where this understanding of the history can really be useful is in understanding where the vulnerable self theme comes from. I think Bronwyn has said that, right? And that really sort of takes some of the bewilderment out of, oh, well, why do I get, in a fundamental sense, right? The vulnerable self theme is inferential confusion applied to the self, notions of the self, right? I mean, it's sort of inferential confusion on steroids, right? So sort of understanding the historical context can take some of the bewilderment out of it. But also, personal experience, difficult personal experiences don't have to be necessarily trauma. The question came up, for example, in ROCD, right? Well, I have been cheated on before, so how do I know that my husband is not cheating on me now? Now, and the question still remains, which is that how do those previous experiences apply in the here and now in the context of your current relationship with your husband and what he's doing, right? Right. Right. And yeah. And so that, so that those previous experiences aren't relevant to what's actually happening in my marriage. Right?
And that can be really hard for people, especially people with big T traumas. Like, I mean, I have a few big T traumas in my life. And for people to say, just ignore that, like that was really hard for me. And but still, just because I get in a car, like I just did a huge cross-country trip this summer, and like I still get in a car even though I had that car accident, because that stuff doesn't apply to right now. Like that's in the past.
Yeah, I think my question kind of was both, have other people seen this connection among OCD clients, but also when you're doing this module, do you kind of hold off on that until you get to the vulnerable self module? Or is there any reason to only really stick to, more, I don't know, experiences that were more, I guess, practical in nature versus, like long-term patterns in your parent-child relationship? To me, it's all really relevant, but
yeah, it's a co-exploration, right? Like your clients are whatever they come up with in that, and when you're doing module 2 is something to listen to, because remember, well, you guys don't know this yet, but next you're going to take all those and you can link them together to make the obsessional story, like what OCD is telling them, right? So you want to get the information if you can get it.
Can I ask a question about perfectionism? I'm just wondering, I think you just said something, Fred, about mistake making and how it can be, the fear that can be wrong in context. And that's a new idea to me. So I'm just curious how I-CBT conceptualizes perfectionism, and if there's a line between perfectionism and perfectionism under the OCD umbrella, and what that means by mistake making being a worry that's out of context.
Well, I mean, perfectionism can be part of the vulnerable self theme in the sense of like, I'm a person that's more prone to make mistakes than others. I'm not sure if that falls entirely on perfectionism, but no, yeah, perfectionism we would see more as an interpretation of symptoms, not necessarily as a causal factor that's specific to OCD. It's very clinically relevant if there is perfectionism, because obviously that complicates things a lot in treatment, right? But it's not necessarily majority of people wouldn't say so, or the majority of researchers wouldn't say so that that is the case, because it's such a transdiagnostic concept to start with. So it's clinically relevant to OCD, but not necessarily a causal factor of it. Yes, and as far as context in OCD and the particular situation in which these doubts arise is a central focus of I-CBT, which is almost all the modules, these modules and all the other modules are about that. These ones lead up to it, but that's module 4 and 5, I believe, that really dives into that. And we have the videos online, but on those modules, which you can, if you want to go ahead, but I probably going to be repeated here as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes, so just knowing that it's transdiagnostic, it is clinically relevant as you're doing the treatment and needs to be addressed.
It's clinically relevant, yeah.
But it's not necessarily. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
I had a question about the perfectionism and the vulnerable self theme, because often if we, have like a fear of making mistakes, and then we kind of look at, well, I'm a person more, oftentimes the vulnerable self theme is, well, if I make mistakes, that proves I'm not good enough. That proves my low self-esteem. Is that, Fred, you had said that it ties back to I'm a person more prone to making mistakes, but would you take that back a step further to, even a more core interpretation of the vulnerable self theme?
Yeah, potentially. I think the point here is that the story and as well as the vulnerable self theme is idiosyncratically defined, not by any particular belief or personality trait of a person with a story that people tell themselves. So it's not like perfectionism is like the thing that causes OCD any more than intolerance to uncertainty or rigidity would account for OCD. But the person can have a story about mistakes, but he can also have a story about other things, that do not fall into those sort of like bigger concepts like perfectionism that have been implicated in OCD before or related to it. So it all depends on the story, which is idiosyncratic first and foremost. And then the question becomes, how is this relevant to the situation in the here and now where these obsessional doubts start to arise? And it's not, because the story itself is constructed in a way that does not make it relevant to the here and now.
Okay, well, thanks for the clarification.
Anybody else?
Okay, well, silence is golden, I guess. Bronwyn, thank you so much. So,
there's a question in the
wonderful.
chat. I think there's a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I missed it. Go ahead.
Wouldn't it be an example of an overarching theme? Paul, do you mean like vulnerable self theme?
Yeah, like when we talk about, I might be a person who's negligent, and that could result in some bad things happening. So is that the self theme that we're talking about when we're being persuaded by OCD that we're something that we're not? And what I'm getting at is I was just wondering if you could verbalize what that might be for somebody with harm or POCD themes, and the same for sexual orientation OCD. What's that overarching, like for lack of a better term, theme that the person is fearful of, that does not align with who they really are. Does that make sense?
I mean, it's dependent on every person's individual. So what you want to do, and I mean, is to take all their doubts and try to figure out what those doubts have in common, right? Like you're going to try to see what those doubts have in common, and then what type of person would do that, would be that. And so it depends. It just depends on everybody.
Do you think it's that varied, or do you think there's some commonality there?
I mean, there's definitely some themes that show up more than other. I mean, I think negligent or irresponsible, all those things can come up a lot.
Yeah.
With POCD or SOOCD, I mean, I don't know. Like in our training that we were doing with Katie when she was doing her vulnerable self theme, Paul, like she had some stuff with like ROCD in there, right? And so, and hers is, I can't remember what her self theme is now, careless. So it just depends. Like it's just depends on each person.
Okay.
Yeah, Paul. I'll add.
So I mean, it could be I'm morally corrupt without knowing it.
Okay.
You know,
Paul, here's I'll add to that.
it can be come across as like, is that I'm not living my life correctly, or I'm lying to myself. I have a liar, sort of a liar type of identity. You know? Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah. Two very common self themes are, particularly when it comes to anything related to doing harm, is that I'm the kind of person who can lose control, right? That there's a fundamental core doubt about one's ability to control oneself.
Okay.
And then also in terms of sort of POCD or sexual orientation OCD, I think it gets back to this idea about, oh, well, out of context facts, is that there's all this repressed stuff, as Fred would say, the unconscious, what is invisible, right? And which then becomes sort of fodder for all kinds of acts of the imagination, right? The deep down inside, I'm, my sexuality is different than what I know myself, in terms of what all my past behavior tells me, right? And that somehow
it's good
somehow that I'm the kind of person who can't know
it's good to be aware of these different. It's good to be aware of these different situations and examples, but at the same time, it's important to keep an open mind rather than looking for one. Let the client tell you what it is. That's the whole point of I-CBT, right? You're looking at the process of what is wrong, not necessarily a particular belief as the cause of the OCD, because it's never. OCD is very heterogeneous. That's why I-CBT works well. It sort of goes beyond the content of it, or the specific belief or that a person may have, and looks at the process and how that fear or how those beliefs or that reasoning, right? That's really what we're talking about, gives rise to obsessional doubts. So it's important not to fix yourself, but like that, and specific feared self themes that seem to be more prevalent than others. And Carl is absolutely correct. That's a big one, losing control. That's
okay. And I kind of suspected that on the harm one. And then as Bronwyn was saying, I realized that there's not a one size fits all or one that's universal, this overarching theme. So like you were saying, Fred, it could be, as far as OCD, that the person thinks that they're this bad, immoral person, or it could be that I'm living a lie, and and again, that kind of goes to morality. I'm living a lie with my spouse who thinks I'm something I'm not, and so anyway, I just thought
it can be
go ahead.
Yeah, it can be all of those things. I'm not the person who I think I am,
Yeah.
There
So
you see the
basically,
fragile
I'm a
identity
fraud.
a little bit right there.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for responding to my question.
Why it's a vulnerable.
Yeah, and let me just say, and you can certainly understand how a psychoanalytic framework or the whole notion of the unconscious can be pouring kerosene on the fire that we all have seen in our patients that have been through that kind of treatment. Right. Once you start theorizing about the unconscious, boy, can that be a mess? Haven't we all seen? Right.
Okay, this time we are at time. So, Bronwyn, thank you very much. Wonderful presentation. For everyone, the slides will be posted online at some point in the Facebook group, and we will get the video posted to the website sometime today, hopefully. All right. Thank you, everyone.